Carla, and I'd like to thank both sides of the House for what seems to be great cooperation. I haven't seen a lot of that in my 9 months. But, Last Carla, I'm sure that all deputies here can now recognise how difficult it is for victims of domestic abuse to deal with and escape from their abuser. First of all, they have to deal with the abuse as it's occurring, which must be absolutely a devastating experience. But being able to get help that's required is far easier said than done. While doing some research on the topic, I was particularly alarmed by the prevalence of domestic abuse and violence reported in 2019, and I was even more alarmed to learn that these figures are much, much higher in 2020. In fact, the recently published Safe Ireland report shows that calls to the helpline increased steadily and daily over the course of COVID-19 restrictions. According to the Women's Aid Annual Report of 2019, there were 19,258 disclosures of domestic violence against women noted during and 20,763 contacts with Women's Aid Direct Services. There were 12,742 incidents of emotional abuse, 3,873 incidents of physical abuse and 2,034 incidents of financial abuse disclosed. And in the same year, 609 incidents of sexual abuse were disclosed, including 288 rapes. As highlighted here, the domestic abuse can take many different forms. With that in mind, my mind is immediately drawn to the physical violence, but it can also include threats, intimidation, manipulation, neglect, financial control, domineering behaviour and other threatening and controlling behaviours. The National Crime Council found that 1 in 7 women have experienced severe abuse, behaviour of a physical, sexual or emotional nature from a partner at some time in their lives. The survey estimates that 213,000 women in Ireland have been severely abused by a partner. These figures display the extent of the problem. And unfortunately, studies show that usually domestic violence is not a one-off event. It often involves a sustained pattern of abuse and manipulative behaviour, which many victims can find it very difficult to escape from. And whilst the evidence shows that women are more likely to be victims of domestic abuse, we must not forget that there are men who also find themselves victims of domestic abuse. Almost 6% of men experience domestic abuse, while the figure for women is 15%. These are very worrying numbers, and it's very clear that this issue affects men and women. Therefore, we need to ensure that support systems in place are both for men and women. We must also remember the huge impact on children, or indeed the children themselves, who can unfortunately often be the victims of such abuse. But even in cases where the child is not the direct recipient of the abuse, they experience the consequences, and this can affect them for the rest of their lives. Wexford's Women Refuge provides 24-hour crisis accommodation for women and children experiencing domestic abuse in their own homes. On admission, many families will present often with little or no personal belongings. The recommended period for a woman and her family to stay in the refuge is 8 to 10 weeks. The refuge, however, has only two rooms available at present. During COVID, the demand for beds rose, but the bed space is reduced. Any reduction in the supply of beds for victims of domestic violence is disastrous. According to a report in the Wexford People back in June, the Wexford Women's Refuge had to reduce their accommodation capacity from 5 families to 1 family due to the communal toilets and bathrooms. Now, I understand their capacity is now for 2 families. We need more services for people in these situations. Those involved in providing the service and working in the Women's Refuge in Wexford do Trojan work, but they do need to be supported and they need the resources to meet the demand. Gardaí have reported a 36% increase in the number of domestic abuse cases in County Wexford over the past year. I have often mentioned in speeches and interviews about the second-line effects of COVID-19 restrictions. Domestic abuse and domestic violence is one of those areas where the consequences of restrictions are very worrying. The Safe Ireland report finds that COVID-19 restrictions led to a number of barriers to victims trying to escape abusive situations. Problems were reported particularly in relation to travel restrictions, accommodation issues and social isolation. So I would like to see increased supports for the sector and to see victims being able to avail of supports as soon as they need it. But more importantly, we need to ensure that this sector is safeguarded from the negative effects of any further COVID restrictions. I will discuss this in greater detail tomorrow, along with the mental health aspects, but this is a good opportunity to remind the Government that we need to take a holistic approach to dealing with many of these problems, because in most cases they are linked. We do not want this problem to get worse, as it can often lead to a cycle of other issues for the victims, including substance misuse, psychological damage, trust issues for both the victims and any children involved. We must also remember that the abusers need support and rehabilitation. They may have an underlying issue themselves, a substance misuse issue, for example. They may need medical intervention, psychological intervention, behavioural therapy and education with a view to trying to prevent them from reoffending. So I'm calling on this problem to be looked at from all angles. And finally, Las Ceann Corla, a message to those who may be currently experiencing domestic abuse. Seek help in any way that you can. The Gardaí, local support services, a trusted friend or family member. Do not suffer in silence. Thank you.